a diversity statement? It is, simply put, talking about your perspective. A lot of times, a diversity statement, someone's usually like, oh, I got to talk about my race, my religion, sexual orientation, all of that. Not really. It's really about conveying your unique perspective. What experiences have informed that perspective? What life experience do you have that makes your perspective unique? So we really want to be clear on what that perspective is when you write your diversity statement. And then the second part to that should be, how does that perspective show up in the classroom or will inform your law career? So the diversity statement comes in two parts. In general, this is a study that I read around 10 years ago, and it talked about how we experience the world. And I know this looks a little funky, but the very bottom, it says hearing, and it's hearing other people's experiences. Listening to other people's experiences is the vast majority of how we get information about the world. So a lot of times you read history books, right? And this also includes like video for the modern age. So, there's people who are notorious TED Talk listeners or TED Talk watchers. Those people are hearing other people's experiences, taking those lessons and kind of interpreting them in their own way. A lot of times, and then the second tier is reading someone's experience. And this kind of talks to, reading someone's diary, which I know a little bit ago was a very popular format of writing. So reading something is the second tier of way of how we experience the world. And then the third tier is us actually doing the experiencing. So, you bungee jumped or you skydived. That's an experience that you have done. The reason why it's in a pyramid is that it's just the sheer number of things, right? We can hear thousands of things over the course of, let's say, a week. We can read a couple books over the course of a month. We can experience unique things, but maybe not every day, every moment, every second, right? So just the sheer number of experiences, yes, it's a lot, but we can know more, learn more, feel more with reading and hearing. However, the potency of what we experience is much more potent in that top tier of what we ourselves experience in our own skin. So yes, you may hear, let's say you may hear about the veterans from World War II. That's different from actually experiencing it. So the potency of that experience is a little bit different, and we want to be aware of that. That's just like very general how to define what we experience. And then experiences with regards to a diversity statement, I like to say splits up into circumstance and choice. And when I say circumstance, these are things like race, gender, community that you grew up in, your family, all of that. Those are circumstances that you really didn't have a choice in. You didn't explicitly choose to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas choice, which this is a bigger category of items, your job, your social activities, your sports, all of that, those are considered what I consider choice. So we're dipping into both buckets when we think about diversity statements. This is kind of a rehash, a little bit of a different diagram here, but of exactly what I just said, right? Circumstances, these are things that, inform a lot of our experiences and provides a lens to an experience, whereas choices, you're a little bit more active in that role. Does that make sense for everyone? Any questions at that point? I know I kind of ran through that one. Alrighty, so moving on. I would love to take us through a activity, and we will do this chart for me, so you will get to know me very well. But this is how I would say, going about writing a diversity statement, you want to kind of pull out all the things that are about yourself, your identity, who you are, and put it into this chart. We unfortunately cannot write about every single thing that you put in this chart as your diversity statement, although that's what makes you unique. I encourage you to pick one, maybe two of those items that resonate with you as a pretty important thing about yourself and write about that. So I'm just going to take you through the process of kind of downloading all the things about yourself into this chart, and then we will go about how to identify what we call perspective for the diversity statement. So getting out of presentation mode, this is for a Yakachin on March 10th, 2021. So circumstances, this is what I say, Japanese American, right? I identify as female. I am 28 years old. I grew up in a family with two parents, sister. I grew up in San Francisco. I did not have a choice in where I grew up, so I put that in circumstance. Yeah, this is kind of, I don't identify with any religion. Yeah, so these are the things that, you know, kind of are basics about me. I guess you could put in like I was born in January, but you know, that's a little too granular. So that's really who you are. And then for choices, for me, something like currently my job, I work in consulting. I also worked in cybersecurity. I was an executive assistant. I worked in compliance and legal in a Japanese domestic company. Let me think. I was a fitness instructor. Oh, hold on. Fitness instructor. I lived in Tokyo for 5 years. Right? What else? Let me see. I went to see Berkeley. Let's see, love to travel. I've been to, I believe, 16 countries and counting. What else? Let me think. I'm an avid skier, love skiing. What else do? I love to cook. See, what else? Let me think. I think, you know, so all these things are choices that we make, right? These are all the things that are a little bit more than what's on your license, on your driver's license, let's say, right? These are all things that are a little bit more, and these are big experiences that I've had, you know, and also include stuff that are big, like life events. I would say something like, you know, if I was not close to my grandfather, but my grandfather died freshman year of college, and I couldn't go back to Japan to see him.
Hey, Ayaka, I have a question actually on this exact like line of your choices that I have seen come up, and essentially like I've seen before people bring up, or maybe in their essays, for say example a diversity statement where they will talk about a family member, like something while like they were in school, and obviously we don't wish harm on anyone, and so I apologize if this is like content warning for anyone, like maybe like a family member suffered like a substance abuse issue or a medical issue, and it impacted the applicant's life, where maybe they were taking a semester off to care for that person, or in in a similar sense of taking care of a family member, maybe they immigrated to another country and it was on the applicant to maybe help their parents, for example, like learn a new language or file paperwork. So, in terms of that sort of like proximity to these experiences, where do you think the applicant like lies in that, in telling their own story, and like how much of it is telling their own story? I mean, I'm sure it's all in execution, but I'm just really interested to hear your thoughts on that. And probably there's not a right answer, but I just see that a lot, and I have it for myself as well.
Awesome question, love it. And I think that's a great point. That some of the things that we might want to talk about in our diversity statement might not be something that you've directly experienced, but you have a second order effect to that actual experience. So for example, if there's some hardship with somebody that you're close with, and therefore there was an effect on your life, your daily life, day to day, stuff like that, like I would focus on the effect on you and how you reacted to that, rather than that event itself. The event itself is not as important in the context of a diversity statement. It's an important event, but not as important as how you react to it, how you've taken that moment that is very, very difficult, and how it's affected your perspective, right? So we want to be very clear that in a diversity statement, it's about yourself. It's not about somebody else. So you want to make sure that you are the center of the story. Not to say that those experiences are not important. Those experiences aren't impactful, but we're looking for how that impacts how you perceive the world and how you view the world, and how that can be helpful in a classroom setting or in law school. So I hope that answers your question. Tell me if it doesn't.
I think you bring up a really great point, and when you said it was about the applicant's perspective, and I've heard this as well, that the applicant, the writer, has to prove that not just that all these things happen to them, but they're a really good, for lack of a better word, a good thinker about what happened to them. And they're able to process that event, and then like their perspective changes, or it alters their actions from there on out. And that's how they bring value to a classroom, is having that additional value. And so I guess and maybe this is like taking a step too far, but like, for example, the last choice that you brought up, and this is actually a really sad event, when your grandfather died freshman year of college, like could you share a little bit about like how would you talk about that?
Yeah,
if you're comfortable with that.
Absolutely. And Alyssa, you're like 3 steps ahead. So we'll talk about how we pull a perspective out. But for example, for this last item that I put here, my grandfather died freshman year of college. Sad event. My extended family all live in Japan, so it would have been 2 weeks out of school just to go see him, which is not possible, especially at UC Berkeley. I don't know if you guys know, but the workload there is kind of insane. So it was just not feasible in any way. And the decision was mine to say, unfortunately, I cannot do some traditional things that, you know, we have to do for when a family member passes. However, I am choosing to stay here and continue my studies because that is important to me. And I know that my grandfather would understand. So that, instead of the focus being, oh, I couldn't go see him, it was such a bad circumstance, it's more talking about my ability to look at that situation and say, rationally thinking, yes, tradition, but also my future, my education. And at that point in time, I needed to prioritize, and I made this a priority to stay in school and to be successful in school. You know, I can go back to Japan in 3 months when it's summer vacation and kind of follow through on the tradition. So it's, that is the story, rather than my grandfather died in an inopportune time in my life, right? So it's, I think that's how you separate out that. How that informs perspective, if we take it one step further, would be, you know, what is rational thought, and how to use rational thought in a time when there's high emotion and duty to family, duty to tradition. You know, can I prioritize myself? And by action, I can. And, you know, rational thought and being very grounded is something that I think you want in a lawyer. So that's a quality that you can highlight in a diversity statement. So
Wow, that's super powerful.
hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, so all this stuff, I think many times we've heard Steve say, you can write a diversity statement. Anyone can write a diversity statement. And I think everyone here has experiences that I've listed in the choices part of this chart, and more. I'm sure there's more experiences out there. I'm probably drawing a blank on stuff, but I'm sure there's a lot more I can put in this. Every single item can turn into a diversity statement. Maybe not the best thing, but every single one can turn into a diversity statement. So now that we have all these topics from my life that we can use, we got to go into how to choose the right one. And I think that takes that one step further into looking into what does it mean in terms of a perspective. So, for example, if we start on the circumstances side, because I think that's a little bit more familiar to people, I see a lot of diversity statements that start off with, I am Asian American, I am Chinese, I'm a Chinese immigrant, or I am Japanese American, or I'm zero generation X, Y, and Z. Great, that's a great start, but I don't know what that means. We don't have a choice in who on the admissions team reads your application. And so great if you have someone who can identify with, oh, she's Japanese American, I am too, I understand what this experience is. That would be awesome, but there's no guarantee that we're going to get that person. So what we have to do really is to guide the reader to say, okay, what does Japanese American mean for this person, right? If we want to start that way. So for me, that means there's a lot of tradition. There's Japanese culture is very informed by Shinto beliefs. There's a lot of Buddhist beliefs. Family is really important. And there's, you know, food and relationship to food is very important. And I know this is really vague, but kind of what I'm trying to show here is that being Japanese American can mean these things, it can mean 100 other things. So, if we want to go one step further, it means high expectations for jobs, right? And education, stuff like that. Like it can mean so many things. We want to define that in your diversity statement, and we want to make sure that it's clear. For example, again, for female, and say, workplace issues comes top to mind. And I was at one point in my career, woman in tech, right? So there's different takes on all these circumstance stuff that you have. So I don't think it's enough to say I'm a female Japanese American and that makes me diverse. I think you have to take it one step further and say I'm Japanese American and I'm a woman where I have experience in a business situation where female issues were not taken seriously, and kind of explain and frame that perspective very clearly. Shifting over to choices, this is where you have a little bit more fluidity and a little bit more stuff that you need to give context. For example, let me see. Let's start with here, consulting. So what does it mean to be in consulting? If you've ever heard of like a consulting position, it's a lot of times it's being one day ahead of the client. A lot of times it requires a lot of speaking with authority, knowing the tech, a lot of organization familiarization, on and on and on. So there's so many things that go into consulting. You want to be very specific. You want to be very pointed in that perspective. You want to be very clear in the beginning. This is my perspective. So if I were to write my diversity statement about consulting, I would talk about, probably these three things, right? Being one day ahead of the client, speaking with authority, and knowing the tech. And I would put it in the context of, when I started my consulting job, it was the first day that we went to work from home due to the quarantine and COVID. And, even in a virtual space, I needed to learn how to do these three things, right? And so you're framing consulting by these three definitions and then putting that situation in and how those three definitions are kind of informing that content of the diversity statement. So it's important to kind of the frame is so important. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's so important. If you take one thing from the session, make sure you understand that the frame of how you set up your diversity statement is probably 90% of the game. The other part to that is the perspective, right? What perspective did I gain from that experience, or what has added perspective to my perspective of the world? And I think for here, I know it gets a little bit nuanced, but it's really anything that has added to your experience. So like, let's say I'm talking about pivoting. And one of the biggest things that I've learned coming out of consulting is being able to be flexible and pivot quicker than your client. And then thinking through eventualities. So you're like, okay, if this happens, this happens. If this happens, then this happens, and kind of be able to logically think through that. And then don't bring all of that to the client, but kind of choose what you think the client needs and then bring it to them. So that's kind of the perspective of being deliberate with, even if you're pivoting and there's a lot of changes going on, being deliberate with what you're presenting instead of presenting the whole platter of things that can happen. Be very deliberate. And I would talk about that perspective. So that diversity statement would look like, with this experience, with X, Y, and Z experience, this is the perspective that came out of that. And then we would need to pivot to, how does that inform, or not inform, sorry, how does that show up in a classroom, or how would that show up in my law career? And I think that probably is a pretty easy transition with that example of, like, in my law career, you know, I would know how to sort through a lot of information, kind of pick what is the most important, what is the most essential, and move forward with that. And I think it's important to follow through with that, just because you are sending this into a law school where they're kind of concerned with what goes on in the classroom. How does that student show up in a law career beyond? So I would really follow through on that, and make sure that you have that in your diversity statement. I know I've talked for now 20 minutes straight. Are there any questions out there at this point? Sorry, and I'm like, I lost my chat somewhere.
I know, and if you pick up on that chat, I'm jumping in, and anyone, please feel free to also just unmute yourself and talk over me if you want to jump in here. But I know in the chat I suggested that the disability, maybe like there's so many, like hearing impairments, visual impairments, speaking impairments, and really the list goes on, that could inform somebody's perspective and the way that they move through the world. And we need more of those people in the law school career and law school field, like law field as well. So I think that would be a great like place to start as well. So I added that kind of into the document, you know, per se, just things to talk about. But I did have a question, Ayaka, in terms of what you're saying about making sure that your essay follows through to highlight a career. And I'm wondering if you do feel that is absolutely a necessity for a diversity statement, or for an essay in general, to point to like this sort of like longer term goal set, or like long term mindset for the applicant, or is talking about getting in that classroom enough? Because many law, like, you don't have to be a lawyer to go to law, like, you know, that doesn't have to be the end goal. So I'm just wondering on where your line is on that.
Thank you for the question. And number one, yes, disability, absolutely. I think that enriches, you know, the information that we have about you and all that. So I think that's a great point, Alyssa. With regards to the follow through, I say, you know, how it shows up in the classroom, or how it might show up in the law career, because a lot of times we're all thinking about that. But, you know, as you said, and you're absolutely right, you know, coming out of law school doesn't mean you have to be a lawyer. I think the minimum that should be done is the future perspective, right? Just say, like, I've gained this perspective, and you live that perspective, and it informs everything you do in the future. I think that's a minimum. I think it's nicer to the reader if it's a little bit more concrete. So as comfortable as you can be with that future perspective, if all you're comfortable with is saying, you know, that perspective is what you'll hold with you looking into the future, I think that's enough. But it would be nice to see, you know, like in the future, like let's say you want to do like family law, like how it would speak to that, if that's how that essay is going. I also think that it is a degree of how well you write as well. So some people are very good with words and can write an amazing ending to their diversity statement that doesn't have to touch on future career at all. So I think it's a balance between that. But I think you should just go as comfortable as you can be, but make sure to follow through to some sort of look to the future, I think is what I would say. Awesome. Jocelyn, I see your hand up.
Yes, I actually had two questions.
Sure.
The first one being that I'm already recognizing with your outline of circumstances and outline of choices that actually my personal statement kind of overlaps with all of these items. And I'm wondering how to, I guess, distinguish that from my diversity statement, since my personal statement is kind of diversity statement, but it's definitely a personal statement in nature. But I'm trying to figure out how to distinguish that. So how would you go about doing so? And then I guess my second question would be, as it relates to diversity statements, I've heard that diversity statements are extensions of the personal statement. I am trying to eliminate duplication because, it doesn't make sense for you to write the same thing that you already have in your personal statement to be in your diversity statement. And so how do you make that connection between your personal statement and your diversity statement in a way that it flows and gives like a full rounded perspective? So yeah, sorry. I know I threw a lot at you, but yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for the questions. I think these are really important questions to ask. So just backing up a little bit here, and this is how I look at a law school application. So if you're like, yeah, that's totally wrong, I don't mind. But how I look at it is like a pie, right? Your LSAT score says something about you. Your GPA says something about you. Your letters of rec is another piece of the pie, and a personal statement and diversity statement, they are also pieces of the pie. And you want to make sure that when you finish your application, it turns into a whole pie. So we want that pie to reflect who you are, maybe not in its entirety, but in essence. And not one piece of the pie is going to, make it or break it. We want everything to be elevated. So, given that, going back to your questions about how you're seeing some of the elements of your personal statement from this chart thing that I have here, I like to look at a personal statement as a big why question. What is your why? Not and I don't mean to say a why law school or why that particular law school or why law career, but more like a why of your life. What is your life work? What is this life that you're trying to lead? And the essence of that. So it's very internal looking. On the flip side, I like to say a diversity statement is external looking. You're showing someone your glasses, right? You're showing someone that, look, I have this and this, and this really informs how I view the world. And how I view the world is distinct and unique from the person next to me. And that is beneficial because X, Y, and Z. So I think the purpose of a personal statement and a diversity statement is kind of opposite of each other. If you're finding that you're talking about the same things in your personal versus your diversity statement, I would go back to your personal statement and see, number one, I would look at the length of your personal statement, because I suspect your statement might be a little long. because that's a lot of stuff to put into one personal statement, or to see if you have more than 3 stories going on into your personal statement. Because a lot of times, and this happened with my personal statement, was I was trying to say so much, and Steve's like, well, this one thing that you talk about here, that could be a diversity statement. So a lot of times you can pull something completely out of your personal statement and turn it to its own diversity statement, and just don't let those 2 things touch each other. I would really be cautious of writing about the same things in your personal diversity statement, just because it gets repetitive. I don't know if I covered everything that you asked, Jocelyn. Please be like, Ayaka, you didn't talk about this. If I didn't, Alyssa, it looks like you have a comment there. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And Jocelyn too, feel free to jump in. Ayaka, I thought that was a beautiful discussion. First of all, I was amazed. I was like, wow, I need to be recording this on all of my things so I can watch it back. Even I know it'll be on YouTube probably later, but I thought that was incredible how you did sort of differentiate between this sort of internal thoughtfulness and also how your lenses, I have this different perspective from the person next to me, most likely, and this is why it's important. And Jocelyn, I just wanted to share my experience too, that this happened to me when I was first writing my personal statement and my diversity statement, in that my personal statement was largely about my past of being a professional tap dancer and what that took in my life and how I achieved that and what that meant to me. And because that largely makes up a big part of who I am. So that was my personal statement. And in the beginning, my diversity statement, I really wanted to showcase, for example, volunteer work, because I wanted to make myself look better. So, but where I volunteer is I volunteer for nonprofit organizations and I teach them dance, which, if we're all being completely honest, it's probably pretty easy for me to volunteer to teach dance because I already know how to dance. In fact, that's not really a really big reach on my end. And I realized that it wasn't really painting a portrait of myself. So I kind of ran into that speed bump on my own, and I don't know if that helps anyone else. So I had to sort of go back to the drawing board and figure out what else about myself. And that conversation aside, I feel that there's a part from this conversation on the whole missing in terms of how an entire essay can really be a zoom in on one moment in life. So I think that this is great, and I know that Ayako, you can expand on this. And you brought up stories and storytelling and how to bring life into what you're saying. For example, in this first part here, when you talk about consulting and being one day ahead of the client, I'm sure, Ayaka, that you would give us a story about a time that needed to happen. But I wanted to just also, I've seen some really fantastic essays that have to do with somebody's one walk in a park. And this one walk through the park makes them think about things in a different way. So I wanted to also remind everyone that if you're finding you're repetitive, it's kind of like what Ayaka said, you could zoom in so intensely on one moment and it could still be a really beautiful essay and effective.
Well, thank you, Alyssa, and I think that's great advice. And just so you know, this is what's listed here. This is really a jumping off point. So, you don't really have to write anything about your life choices if you don't want to. You could really talk about anything you want, because anything can turn into a diversity statement. I think this can get your creative juices going. So take that as it is. And then Jocelyn, I see your hand raised again.
Yeah, so I guess in response to the wealth of knowledge that you guys have been sending my way, which I totally appreciate, I definitely, so as it relates to my personal statement, my personal statement, I've went through several drafts and I have it about 1,000 words, maybe that, and I'm pretty proud of that because it was like 6 pages about the story of my life. And so like I really had to, like you said, you really have to narrow down one specific moment and really explain the why. But when I'm talking about, I guess in terms of things of overlap, I should have probably been more specific, is that like, so talking about racism is a common theme that I'm seeing in relation to my personal statement and my diversity statement, because it impacted my life so much so. And I guess I made a lot of choices as directly, I guess, in my experience dealing with it. And so I'm trying to like make sure that, I guess, my personal statement and my diversity statement, while it does flow, it's not like, I don't know, because I don't want to say generic, because it's not going to be generic, but I guess in the season where we're talking about like, a lot of social and problems, a lot of inequities and different things of that nature, I'm very conscious of the fact that a lot of people are going to be talking about their experiences with racism, COVID-19, etc. Right? And so I'm just looking to, I guess, make sure that my, I guess, diversity statement and personal statement, while they connect, they're very distinct in nature, with everyone having a story to share. But I don't want it to be like, oh, it's one of those stories, that we're constantly getting. So I don't know if that clarifies, but thank you like so much for giving me a perspective and a direction on how to, I guess, handle my diversity statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I really hear your concerns about, writing an essay about, racism and social, what do you call it now? I'm blanking for words now, but like, disruption and all of that. And, it's funny, I was talking to someone else who who was writing their personal statement about how they experienced Black Lives Matter last year. And so I do think, and I'm sure you are very much aware that it's going to be a very common topic to write about. How you can make that unique and personal is how you experienced it, and being very much focused on your experience, and not just like, oh, it happened in my city and it made you think about X, Y, and Z. It's like, no. Let's go way more deeper. You're going to have to dig really deep into that, and kind of tell us about what elements went into you feeling the way that you feel, to experiencing it in the way that you experienced it. I know I mentioned it in my personal statement class, I believe about a month ago, that like these very big events that happen in our nation and across the world, COVID, Black Lives Matter, those big events, those are easy for a admissions officer to read, because it's really easy to understand circumstance that way. However, it takes a lot of bringing yourself into the essay, and that might be a really hard process, but I'm sure, Jocelyn, you're doing very well with it. And you just have to bring a lot of yourself to that essay, compared to something like, very niche, like if you're an electrical engineer with PG&E and you experience the blackouts in Houston, like that might be something that's, a little bit more niche and a little bit more technical. And so you might need to lean on the side of giving more context rather than bringing a lot more of yourself there, in that sort of essay. So it's a balance, and I see what you're saying. And I think alleviating part of that like genericness is really bringing yourself into that essay a lot more than you think you need to. So I hope I see your essay one day in one of the essay writing classes that we are running in the future. But yeah, let me know if you have any follow-up questions there, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think I'm pretty much done with the personal statement. I've had some people looking over it. I just don't want like too many people looking at it to like, I guess you don't want too many, people cooking in the kitchen, so to speak. But yeah, I can totally like send it and talk to you about it. And hopefully in the next week or so, I will have had my first draft for my diversity statement and get that going. So exciting.
Question for you, Jocelyn, and I'm sorry, I know Marcos, you're here as well, so feel free to jump in whenever. But do you have like a general idea, or has this class kind of given you a general idea of how to approach your diversity statement?
Yeah, so I can actually kind of give you a spiel of my personal statement so you can see how it's distinct from the diversity statement. So as it relates to, I guess, how racism and its direct impact on my life, I talk about briefly the impact of my father's lawsuit with like racial discrimination in job employment, which I think is a very specific niche, right? That's not something that I think a lot of people are talking about, even though we have like, Black Lives Matter and all of that. But I briefly talk about that, but then I bring that into how did that affect me and my why, and all the decisions and choices that I made after that, and essentially summing up like my reasoning for why I really had an interest in employment law, right, and labor law, because of that impact. But then also a self-discovery and my interest in getting into politics and DC internships and the like. So that's pretty much the personal statement, in summary. But now that I'm moving to the, I guess, diversity statement portion, I'm currently working on research on a Black woman-led labor movement. And actually next week I'll be presenting the research and whatnot. And so I think I'm going to go that route for the diversity statement, and explaining kind of like my outlook on the world, even though it does connect to the personal statement in the sense of I'm talking about employment, my personal experience with the law and employment and employment practices and protections and that sort of thing. I think that discussing my research, my historical research, I think would bring like a different take, and I think like a perspective, an external perspective, right? Because I'm still going towards my future, I guess, my future career, and working as a civil rights attorney, dealing with employment law, racial discrimination, that sort of thing. But it's coming from a different perspective of I'm using my analytical skills. I'm doing research. I'm all of these other skills that I'm building, and I guess informing me historically about my world as it relates historically to employment and labor politics. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I'm going with that.
No, I think that's awesome, and I think that's great. And when you said research, I was like, oh my God, analytical skills, and you said it, so I was like, yes, like I think that's great. And yes, you're talking about something similar that's in your personal statement, but you have this like analytical angle, research angle, which is very different, right? It's not just you experiencing, and seeing your father go through that lawsuit and then seeing the Black Lives Matter, like it's very different. So I think you'll be successful in writing that essay, and it'll be, different enough that it does its purpose. And yeah, I think that's a great direction to go. So sounds amazing. Yes, as Alyssa said, impressive. If there's no more questions out there, I'm happy to give everyone back 9 minutes.
Actually, I do have one more question.
Yeah.
All right. I came specifically because I was like, I have been struggling with trying to figure out this personal or not personal, but diversity statement. So like when we talk about the length of a diversity statement, how long do you think it should be? Should it be about 1,000 words or less? Because again, I don't know. I don't know how, like, the weight in which, schools look at or hold the diversity statement opposed to the personal statement. Because I hear the personal statement basically preach this gospel, and then like the diversity statement's like, well, you could have it, and it's kind of like lost in the details. So can you kind of unpack that for me?
Sure. I believe, and there is some variance by school, but I believe, the diversity statement is about 500 words, or one page double spaced on a standard page. So it's not a lot of words to write. It's not a lot of space. And so that's why, I was making this emphasis on, like, talk about maybe one, maybe two things of all the things that you want to talk about, which is unfortunate because, we're not made of one or two things in our life, but, pick and choose what you're talking about. Alyssa did point out to me earlier, she was like, some schools don't have a diversity statement. What to do then? Which is very true. And so in that case, I would look at your personal statement again, see if you can bring back elements of your diversity statement, and still make that personal statement work. As you said, Jocelyn, every school is going to have a personal statement section. Every school may not have diversity statement. They may have other extra essays that you can send in, and see if you can pull in those elements from your diversity statement into those extra essays if they have space for that. I would, if there's a space to write an essay, write the essay. And it can be in the form of breaking apart your diversity statement into two essays and putting that in, and make sure that the intent of the essay is very clear when you're writing these. But I think, as you said, personal statement, that's going to be a must-have in your application. So that should be the strongest. I encourage people, and it sounds like you're already thinking about the diversity statement, so I don't think this is a problem for you, but there are people who are like, well, I don't think I have a diversity statement to write, which I'm like, everyone has a diversity statement to write, so write one. And, there's something that is not captured by your resume, your LSAT score, your GPA, the letters of rec, your personal statement, like whatever is not captured there, you need to capture in some way in the extra essays or the diversity statement. So really, it's your chance to have the admissions officers know more about you. So we want to bring as much information there as possible. I think I went beyond your question there, but so it can be something you drop, but I would not drop it just because you don't want to write one. I think if there is no space for it, then that's unfortunate. If there's any space to write anything else, I would format it in a way that works for that prompt and put it in.
I'm jumping in. Jocelyn, well, it looked like you had something to say too.
Go ahead. I'll wait.
I'm feeling a little like, I'm feeling like, well, what about this idea? And I know that some schools have what they call a programmatic contribution. And basically it's a fancy way of saying they want you to look at their catalog, the courses that they offer, and like maybe I'm running out of words here, but like what's it called when they do like fake trials? Wow. Things like this. Okay, mock trial and the review, maybe if a school has a journal. So what the programmatic contribution essay is basically to prove that you've taken a look at what that school has to offer. And then you want to take what you have to offer and say, this is how I want to contribute to that program. And Jocelyn, when you were talking about your diversity statement and in terms of it being like with your research skills and the work you've done there, I got really excited with the possibility that you could potentially research the school's programs and say, and then use your research and use that and say, and I would like to use these skills for this particular mock trial that you offer, or I would like to be a student that helps start a new program that's adjacent to this one that I see you have. And I think that that could be really exciting. And it could also really then, like in the race of your personal and diversity right now, where they're addressing the same things, I think it could really like pull ahead and separate them out in terms of like this really reflective internal way of writing. And then this like, oh, by the way, I have these really awesome skills. I'm ready to use them. I've taken a look at your program. I would either like to use them in this one or help start a new one that works off of this one that I'm looking at here. Like you could definitely try that.
Yeah, that's actually like a really awesome idea. To I guess further expound on that. So I have been looking into, various programs and making sure to include like a section in the personal statement that I guess tips them by me saying that, hey, I'm really interested. I did my research and I looked at this program. I think that it nicely ties into what I'm going for and the direction that I'm going for. Would you say that as far as the diversity statement portion, I can essentially take that, I guess, that sliver that's mentioned in the personal statement and expound on that really in the diversity statement, and connect that to basically what Ayaka said as far as the future, as far as career goals or where you see yourself in the future, and then also, I guess, this external perspective and your outlook on life and the vision, and connect that to the external versus the internal, which is a part of the personal statement.
For sure. And I think you nailed the head of the nail with that one. I think, you can mention the same program. We want to make sure we're not rehashing the same thing as the personal statement, but kind of, and I love how you flipped it and said, how is that, how will you show up to that program, or how will you show up to that classroom, and even beyond, right? And so I think that you've put it beautifully there. Well, awesome. This was a lovely conversation. Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you, Alyssa. And thank you, Marcus, for being here. And, I hope this has given you direction a little bit into your diversity statement. So thank you so much for being here. We're almost at the top of the hour. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you have your diversity statement and want it, reviewed during one of these classes, feel free to send it to Steve, and Alyssa and I will do a live review at some point in the future.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.